Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by LaShaw to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're here, chances are you're thinking about parenthood, relationships, or maybe just how those two really connect, sometimes in complicated ways. Today, we're jumping straight into some pretty recent research. It's a 2024 study from the Journal of Sexual Medicine. And it looked at something really specific, how society's views, the way we think about mothers as sexual beings, might actually link up with the sexual well-being of parents, especially those with young kids.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because these are assumptions that might be floating around, maybe influencing experiences without us even consciously clocking them.
So before we dive into this particular study, maybe it's worth just quickly touching on something pretty common for new moms. We all kind of know that having a child is this massive shift, right? And the stats really back that up. We're talking pretty significant numbers. Like in the first 3 months after birth, anywhere from 41% to over 86% of women report some kind of sexual difficulty.
Wow, that's a huge range, but even the low end is substantial.
It is. And even 6 months out, it's still hovering around 64%. So it's definitely not a rare thing.
Not at all. And while obviously physical recovery is a big part of it, research also points to, a whole range of other things.
Like what?
Like shifts in identity, how you see yourself, body image stuff, the support you have, but also these sort of cultural messages and attitudes about women and sex. There's this cultural idea has been around a while that, being a good mother and being a sexual woman, they don't really go together.
Yeah, it's like there's this unwritten script. Being a mom means XYZ, and maybe being openly sexual isn't on that list for some people.
And there's already research linking, generally negative sexual attitudes to lower sexual function in both men and women.
Right. That sets the stage. So this 2024 study we're focusing on, what was unique about its question? What were they trying to pinpoint?
They really zoomed in on this specific idea. Attitudes toward mothers as sexual beings. Let's call it ATMSB for short.
ATMSB, got it.
They wanted to see if those specific attitudes correlated with the sexual function of mothers themselves and also their partners, who in this study were mostly men. And they focused on couples with their first child, under 5 years old.
So not just general attitudes about sex, but specifically attitudes about mothers and sex.
Exactly. That's the key distinction here, because we know the general stuff can have an impact, but this is drilling down into that specific cultural view of motherhood.
That feels important. So how did they measure this? What did the research actually look like?
Well, they used an online survey. They got responses from 475 people, both women and their male partners, all first-time parents within the last 5 years.
Okay.
And these participants filled out questionnaires measuring their ATMSB, those attitudes we mentioned, and also their own current sexual functioning. It's important to note, the researchers themselves point this out. The group was mostly cisgender, heterosexual, and white. We should definitely circle back to that later. It's a limitation.
Okay, good flag. So they collected all this data. What popped out? What were the main findings when they crunched the numbers?
Well, one of the really significant findings was about the mothers. More positive attitudes toward mothers as sexual beings, so a more accepting view strongly predicted higher levels of sexual functioning reported by the women themselves.
Higher levels across the board, or in specific areas?
Pretty much across the board. We're talking desire, arousal, lubrication, orgasm, and just general satisfaction. Interestingly, it also predicted pain, though that connection was a bit weaker than the others.
Wow, that's quite a link. It suggests that these societal views aren't just abstract ideas. They might connect to actual physical and emotional experience.
Precisely. The study authors kind of highlight this, that women often report feeling this pressure, to be less sexy once they become mothers.
Right.
And this research seems to show that those wider views, those societal pressures, have a tangible connection to their actual sexual function. Like those external messages get internalized and maybe even affect physiology.
That makes a lot of sense, unfortunately. What about the partners?
Yeah.
The men in the study. Did these attitudes connect to their experiences too?
Yes, they did. The study found that men who held more positive ATMSB also reported higher levels of their own sexual functioning.
In what ways?
Things like their ability to get and keep an erection, their ability to orgasm, and the frequency and quality of erections. They also just reported higher overall sexual function generally.
Okay.
But here's a slight nuance. Positive ATMSB didn't significantly predict fewer self-reported problems with sexual function in men, just higher function overall.
That's interesting. So higher function, but not necessarily fewer reported problems. Yeah. Any thoughts on why that might be, or why a man's view of mother's sexuality would impact his function?
The researchers suggest something they call a partner effect. Basically, if women feel less sexual or less able to initiate because of these pressures,
it naturally affects the dynamic and the partner's experience.
Exactly. It could influence frequency or engagement. It's also possible that holding these more positive, maybe more empathetic views acts as a kind of buffer for men against the dip in sexual function that sometimes happens for couples in early parenthood.
So it fosters a better environment within the relationship, perhaps?
Potentially, yeah. A more supportive dynamic. It paints a picture of how interconnected this all is within the couple.
Definitely. So, stepping back, what's the big picture message here? What are the broader implications of finding these connections?
I think the core message is that this study really suggests a strong link between our cultural scripts about mothers and sex and the real-life sexual experiences of parents.
It challenges that old idea, doesn't it? The sort of Madonna whore complex applied to motherhood, the good mother, isn't supposed to be sexual.
Absolutely. It pushes back against that false dichotomy. These findings indicate that maybe we need to move past seeing those as opposing things. Holding on to those restrictive views seems to have, well, potentially negative consequences for sexual well-being during a pretty demanding life stage.
Yeah, it feels like society often boxes mothers into very narrow roles, and sexuality just gets erased.
Exactly. And this research gives some evidence that those erasures, those limitations, can actually hurt.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let's just revisit those limitations you flagged earlier. What should we keep in mind about this study?
Right. So first, it's cross-sectional. That means it's just a snapshot in time. We see in association positive attitudes linked with better function, but we can't definitively say one causes the other from this data alone.
Correlation, not causation.
Got it.
Precisely. Also, it focused on individual reports, not necessarily the couple's dynamic as a whole, even though sex is often, a shared thing.
True.
And as we mentioned, the sample was mostly heterosexual, cisgender, and white. So these findings might not apply in the same way to, say, same-sex couples, gender-expansive parents, or parents from different racial or ethnic backgrounds. We definitely need more diverse research.
Really important context. It shows where the gaps still are.
It's a valuable piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture yet. Okay, so bringing it all together then, what's the fundamental takeaway from this deep dive?
The core takeaway is pretty clear. How we as a society and as individuals view mothers as sexual beings seems to have a real measurable connection to the sexual well-being of parents during those early years of child rearing.
It's not just in your head, it links to actual experience.
It appears so. It suggests these cultural beliefs have tangible weight.
That's powerful. And it kind of leaves you thinking about, well, the messages all around us, right?
It really does. And maybe a provocative thought to leave listeners with is this. Take a moment to consider the messages you receive, maybe subtly or not so subtly, about mothers and sexuality. From media, from conversations, maybe even from your own internal thoughts.
How might those messages be shaping your own views or even experiences?
Exactly. Whether you're a parent yourself or not, it just invites a bit of reflection on those ingrained assumptions.
A really useful exercise.
And maybe, for parents listening, it could spark a conversation with a partner or encourage looking into resources that challenge some of those more restrictive views out there.
This has been really illuminating. Thanks for walking us through this research.
My pleasure. It's definitely an important conversation to be having.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by LaShaw. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SOUNDRAW.